In March of 1976, in a room inside Kensington Palace, Princess Margaret answered a telephone and was told by her private secretary that her husband wanted out. Not her husband himself, not Tony Armstrong-Jones, speaking across a table or standing in a doorway. A secretary, a voice carrying news that had been formalized before it had been spoken. By then, Margaret was 45 years old. She had been married for nearly 16 years. She had already lived through the notes hidden in drawers, the women at hospital bedsides, the long evenings of waiting upstairs while her husband disappeared into rooms that did not include her. And when the message was delivered, that Lord Snowdon wanted the marriage ended, Margaret, by later account, did not cry. She did not plead. She said it was the best news he had ever given her. That moment was not just the collapse of a royal marriage. It was the point at which one of the most glamorous couples in Britain stopped being an image and became what they had privately been for years. A household built on silence, humiliation, divided loyalties, and damage the public never saw. This is the story of Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon across nearly 2 decades of marriage and 4 decades of aftermath. Of the love affair that looked like modernity, the private cruelty that sat behind it, the children who grew up inside its wreckage, and the palace that could manage appearances far more easily than it could protect the people living behind them. But to understand how a princess of the United Kingdom ended up searching her own drawers for evidence of her husband's contempt, you have to go back further than the marriage, further than the engagement, further even than the night Tony Armstrong-Jones first walked into her life with a camera and a talent for making powerful women feel seen. You have to go back to 2 separate inheritances, one royal, one not, and to the quiet, devastating logic by which they were always going to collide. This is not a story about one bad husband. It is a story about what happens when a woman raised inside the most surveilled family in Britain marries a man who refuses to be contained by anything, and about the children who grew up in the wreckage, and about an institution that preferred silence to truth for as long as silence was possible. It stretches across 4 decades, touches 3 generations, and leaves its mark on every person it reaches. The name at the center of it is Windsor, but the damage was done under another name entirely, Armstrong-Jones. And in the rooms where no cameras were ever meant to go, to understand it, start with the woman. And to understand the woman, start with the system that made her. Princess Margaret Rose was born on the 21st of August 1930 at Glamorous Castle in Scotland, the younger daughter of the Duke of York and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. By the time Margaret was 6 years old, history had already rearranged her life without consulting her. Her uncle, Edward VIII, had abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Her father had been made king against his own temperament and his own wishes, and the family had moved from the relative quiet of 145 Piccadilly to Buckingham Palace. Margaret did not choose any of this. No one asked her. She was simply absorbed into the apparatus of monarchy, the rituals, the public duties, the protocol, the expectation that private feeling would always yield to institutional need, and expected to perform her role with grace. The role itself was a peculiar one. She was not the heir. That was Elizabeth, 4 years older, steady, serious, already being groomed for the throne from childhood. Margaret was the spare, the younger daughter whose function in the system was less clearly defined and whose temperament was wildly unsuited to the constraints that came with her position. She was the livelier sister, the wittier one, the one who sang, who smoked, who stayed up late and made people laugh in ways that occasionally made courtiers anxious. Where Elizabeth was measured and composed, Margaret was sharp and vivid and restless. She had a singing voice that professionals took seriously. She had a sense of humor that could charm a room or cut a man to pieces depending on her mood. And she was beautiful, genuinely, dangerously beautiful. In a way that drew attention, she was simultaneously expected to attract and forbidden to act upon. By her 20s, she had become one of the most glamorous women in Britain, a style icon, a fixture in London's social world, a princess who seemed to belong as much in a Soho jazz club as in a receiving line at the palace. Photographers loved her. Designers wanted to dress her. Men wanted to be near her. The public adored her with an intensity that was partly admiration and partly projection. She was the sister who seemed to feel things, the one who looked like she might actually be having a good time, the one who made royalty look for a moment like something more than duty and ermine. But underneath that image, Margaret was learning this central lesson of her life, that she could want things desperately, visibly, and still not be allowed to have them. The proof came in the form of Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was 16 years Margaret's senior, a decorated Battle of Britain hero, handsome, honorable, and divorced. And by the early 1950s, he and Margaret were deeply in love. The relationship was not secret exactly. Courtiers knew. The family knew. At the Queen's coronation in June of 1953, Margaret was observed brushing a piece of lint from Townsend's jacket, a gesture so intimate, so casually possessive, that it was noticed by journalists and reported around the world. The implication was unmistakable. The princess was in love with a man she could not marry, because Townsend was divorced, and Margaret was third in line to the throne, and the Church of England, of which her sister was supreme governor, did not recognize remarriage after a divorce. The same church, the same principle, the same institutional rigidity that had caused the abdication crisis a generation earlier now stood between Margaret and the only man she had ever loved with uncomplicated conviction. The establishment closed ranks. The Prime Minister was consulted. The Archbishop of Canterbury made his position clear. Margaret was offered a choice that was not really a choice at all. She could marry Townsend and renounce her place in the succession, her civil list income, and her position within the royal family, or she could give him up. In October of 1955, Margaret issued a public statement. She would not marry Townsend. She cited her duty to the Commonwealth and the Church. She was 25 years old, and in that moment she learned something about the family she had been born into that would shape every decision she made afterward. That the institution would always come first, that her desires were negotiable, and that the price of being a princess was the surrender of the one thing that might have made the title bearable. That wound never fully healed. It is the piece of Margaret's story that makes everything that came after intelligible, and not as excuse, but as context. She did not simply move on from Townsend. She moved on from the belief that her own happiness would ever be permitted to win. And when, a few years later, she met a man who seemed to offer everything Townsend had represented: excitement, desire, escape from the suffocating predictability of royal life. She reached for him with the urgency of someone who had already been denied once and could not bear to be denied again. There is something about that urgency worth sitting with, because without it, the marriage to Tony Armstrong-Jones looks like a mismatch anyone could have predicted. With it, the marriage becomes the most human decision Margaret ever made. She chose passion over caution. She chose a man her family found fascinating, but faintly alarming. She chose the version of her life that felt like living rather than performing. She was not naive. She was desperate, and the desperation was entirely earned. Now turn to the other inheritance, because this story has two root systems, and the second one is just as tangled. Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones was born on the 7th of March, 1930, the same year as Margaret, a coincidence the press would later find charming, into a family that occupied a particular stratum of English life. Gentry, professional, cultured, connected, but not royal, not landed in the great estate sense, not insulated by the kind of wealth that makes eccentricity affordable. His father, Ronald Armstrong-Jones, was a barrister who moved in good society. His mother, Anne Messel, came from a distinguished Anglo-German family with deep roots in the arts. Her brother, Oliver Messel, would become one of the most celebrated stage designers of the 20th century. The family had taste, intelligence, and access. What it did not have was stability. Tony's parents divorced when he was a small boy and both remarried. Ronald to an Australian actress named Carol Coombe, Anne to Michael Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross. Tony grew up divided between households, between countries, between competing versions of what family meant. He spent school holidays at Birr Castle in Ireland with his mother and stepfather, and term times at English boarding schools, where the other boys' families were more straightforwardly intact. He learned early that charm could compensate for rupture. He learned that wit was a form of armor. He learned that if you were clever enough and amusing enough and sexually alert enough, the doors of rooms that had not been built for you would open, and once inside you could make yourself indispensable. before anyone thought to ask whether you truly belonged. At the age of 16, polio struck. Tony spent a year in hospital. He lost significant function in one leg, a disability he would spend the rest of his life disguising with such determination that many people who knew him socially had no idea he walked with a limp beneath the careful tailoring. The illness marked him. It gave him a particular fury about vulnerability, his own and eventually other people's. A boy who had already learned to navigate divided loyalties and social uncertainty now had a body that had betrayed him, and the lesson he drew from it was not patience or empathy, but resolve. He would not be pitied. He would not be limited. He would not allow anyone ever to see him as diminished. That resolve drove his ambition, his restlessness, his professional brilliance, and eventually his cruelty. Because a man who cannot tolerate weakness in himself will often punish it savagely when he finds it in someone he's supposed to love. He went up to Cambridge, where he read architecture, coxed the university boat, and discovered photography, not as a hobby, but as a vocation that suited his temperament perfectly. The camera gave him access without requiring submission. He could enter any room, study any face, capture any intimacy, and remain in control of what the image said. By his mid-20s, he had built a serious professional reputation. He shot theater programs, magazine assignments, and society portraits that were technically accomplished and psychologically acute. He had a gift, people commented on it consistently, for making his subjects feel they were the only person in the room. That gift was, of course, a seduction technique as much as an artistic one. The National Portrait Gallery holds his work as a significant contribution to 20th century British portraiture. Christie's has presented his photographs in major sales. He was not a dilettante who happened to marry well. He was a working artist who understood images, surfaces, staging, and public myth, and who entered Margaret's world already armed with a vocation and a self that did not depend on her. That independence was part of the attraction, and it is important to say so plainly, because without understanding what Tony represented after Townsend, the marriage looks merely reckless. After the gray years of dutiful appearances and appropriate suitors who bored her, after the slow, quiet humiliation of being the princess who had been denied, Tony must have felt like oxygen. He was funny. He was irreverent. He came from the arts, not the aristocracy, though he understood the aristocracy well enough to move through it without deference. He did not treat Margaret's rank as a barrier to intimacy or as a reason to behave with caution. He teased her. He challenged her. He refused to play the courtier. And for a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by people who either deferred to her or controlled her, that refusal was intoxicating. His circle was part of the appeal. Through Tony, Margaret gained access to a London she had only glimpsed from the edges: photographers, theater people, designers, musicians, bohemians, men and women who lived by talent rather than title. His world was glamorous in a way that had nothing to do with crowns or protocol. It was the glamour of creation, of late nights in studios, of people who made things. Margaret, who had always been artistic, who sang and sketched and had opinions about design that were sharper than most people gave her credit for, responded to that world with an appetite that told you everything about how starved she had been. But there was a darker inheritance running alongside the brilliance, and it was visible to anyone paying close attention. Tony's romantic life, before Margaret, was complicated, layered, entangled, and not easily sorted into categories the 1950s would have found comfortable. His friendships blurred into intimacies. His relationship with Jeremy and Camilla Fry was close in ways that biographers would spend decades trying to untangle. Jeremy had originally been named as Tony's best man for the royal wedding, but withdrew under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The official reason was ill health, but the withdrawal carried an air of unresolved difficulty. Camilla Fry gave birth to a daughter, Polly, in 1960, the year of Tony's wedding to Margaret. Decades later, in 2004, a DNA test confirmed what some had long suspected. Polly's biological father was not Jeremy Fry, but Tony Armstrong-Jones. That fact lay 44 years in the future at the time of the wedding, but the entanglement was already present at the foundation of the marriage. Tony did not arrive at the altar as a man whose emotional life was simple. He arrived as a man whose architecture was built on compartments. And compartments, once the habit is set, tend to multiply. His father reportedly warned him that marrying Margaret would ruin his career. Tony went ahead anyway. Whether he loved her, wanted the challenge, wanted the access, or simply could not resist the most dramatic conquest of his life, is a question the marriage itself would answer more honestly than any proposal. Before the wedding itself, consider the figures who would surround this marriage and shape its private reality. Queen Elizabeth II was not a spectator. She was the institutional weight of the story, oldest sister, sovereign, head of the family, guardian of continuity. She had consented to Margaret's engagement. She had watched her younger sister suffer through the Townsend affair and had seen the damage that institutional refusal had inflicted on someone she loved. When Margaret chose Tony, Elizabeth did not block the match. The palace machinery moved to accommodate it, but Elizabeth's role was more complex than consent. She was the throne itself, and every act of Margaret's life, every marriage, every crisis, every private indiscretion, existed inside the frame of her sister's reign. Elizabeth could not rescue Margaret from an unhappy marriage without acknowledging that unhappiness publicly, and public acknowledgement threatened the image of stability on which the monarchy depended. So Elizabeth did what the crown has always done. She maintained, she managed, she trusted discretion, and she waited. The Queen Mother occupied a different space. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was the older generation's warmth and its silence simultaneously. Indulgent, glamorous, in her own well-maintained way, socially brilliant, and absolutely steeped in the aristocratic conviction that appearances were not merely important but sacred. She had been pleased by Margaret's engagement. She liked Tony's wit, his charm, his ability to light up a dinner table. What she could not have foreseen was that the qualities that made him delightful in company would make him devastating in private. In the story of this marriage, the Queen Mother matters not as a plot driver, but as an atmospheric pressure. She embodied the world in which Margaret's suffering would be interpreted as something to be borne quietly, managed gracefully, and never discussed beyond the smallest possible circle. Lady Anne Glenconner was the witness. Margaret's lady-in-waiting, her closest friend, her companion on Mustique and in London, Anne came from the same aristocratic world but carried within it a quality that made her indispensable. She paid attention, she remembered, and she eventually spoke about what she had seen with a specificity that gave the private reality of this marriage a texture no newspaper had ever captured. Anne would later describe the notes Tony left for Margaret in drawers and in books, private insults tucked where only she would find them, calculated not to wound in the heat of argument, but to ambush her in moments of solitude. That testimony is not hearsay. It is the intimate, first-person account of a woman who stood closer to Margaret's daily life than almost anyone outside it. In a story this long, Anne is not a minor character. She is the bridge between what the public saw and what actually happened, and without her, much of what follows would remain speculation. Peter Townsend, alive and living in France, with a Belgian wife and children of his own, haunted the story without being present in it. He was the love Margaret had lost to duty, and his ghost was corrosive in a specific way. Every time the marriage to Tony turned cruel, every time contempt replaced tenderness, the memory of Townsend was there. Quiet, aching, the reminder that she had been promised freedom after sacrifice and had instead found a different variety of captivity. Tony was supposed to be the answer to Townsend. He became the proof that there had never been an answer at all. Two more figures belong here, not because they are present at the beginning of this marriage, but because they will shape its ending and its aftermath in ways that no one standing in Westminster Abbey in 1960 could have anticipated. The first is Roddy Llewellyn. He will not enter Margaret's life for more than a decade, but when he does, he will arrive at the exact moment when the marriage has hollowed her out and she is reaching, almost involuntarily, for anyone who can make her feel visible again. Roddy was younger, 17 years younger, charming, unsteady in his own life, a would-be gardener and socialite who lacked Tony's ferocity but offered something Tony had long since stopped providing: kindness. He was not a solution. He was a symptom, but he will become the figure through whom Margaret's private unhappiness finally becomes a public scandal, because a photograph of them together on holiday will do what years of discreet misery could not. It will force the institution to acknowledge, in the language of official statements, that this marriage was over. The second is Lucy Lindsay Hogg. She enters Tony's story later, as the woman he is with when the marriage finally collapses, and she matters because she transforms his pattern from serial infidelity into structural replacement. By 1978, she will be his second wife. By 1979, she will be the mother of his daughter, Frances. And the speed of that transition, divorce finalized in July, remarriage in December, will tell Margaret and the watching world everything they need to know about how thoroughly she had been superseded. And then there are the children. David Armstrong-Jones, born in 1961, Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones, born in 1964. They are the generation that inherits the cost. They will grow up inside this marriage, absorbing its atmospheres, witnessing its deteriorations, learning from their parents' example what love looks like when it has curdled into performance and warfare. In adulthood, both will turn away from the public spectacle that defined their parents' union and toward quieter vocations, David to furniture making and design, Sarah to painting and the fine arts, as though the next generation had decided, consciously or not, that the only inheritance worth keeping was craft. But none of that is visible yet. In 1960, David and Sarah are not even born. They exist only as possibility, and the marriage that will shape them has not yet begun to show its teeth. The wedding took place on the 6th of May, 1960, at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests, 20 million television viewers in Britain, and hundreds of millions more around the world. It was the first British royal wedding to be broadcast live on television in its entirety, and that fact matters structurally because it made Margaret's marriage one of the founding myths of televised royalty. The nation did not simply hear about this union. They watched it, they invested in it, they believed in it. Margaret wore a gown by Norman Hartnell, the same designer who had dressed her sister for the coronation. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The cheering along the route from the Abbey to Buckingham Palace was genuine, enormous, and full of the hope that the country attached to its beautiful, complicated princess. Tony looked handsome and slightly dazed by the scale of what he had entered. Margaret looked radiant. They departed for a honeymoon in the Caribbean aboard the royal yacht Britannia, a beginning so perfect it could have been staged. And in a sense, given that both bride and groom understood the power of images better than almost anyone alive, it had been. They settled into an apartment at Kensington Palace, not a house they had chosen together, but rooms within a royal property, allocated by the institution, surrounded by staff, by protocol, by the quiet surveillance that was the price of Margaret's birth. In October of 1961, Tony was created Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley, receiving the title the palace considered necessary for the husband of a princess. The earldom gave him a place in the system. He was no longer simply the photographer who had married a princess, but a peer of the realm. And whether he wanted that place, or quietly resented it, or merely accepted it as the cost of the life he had chosen, his later behavior would answer more honestly than anything he said at the time. David was born on the 3rd of November 1961, barely 18 months after the wedding, and christened David Albert Charles. He arrived into a household that was still, at that point, functional. Two parents who were still charmed by each other, a palace apartment that hummed with staff and visitors and creative energy. Sarah followed on the 1st of May 1964, by which time the atmosphere had already begun to shift. Neither child would later speak publicly, in any sustained way, about what it was like to grow up inside this particular marriage, and that silence is itself revealing. The children of this union learned early that the family's private reality was not something you discussed. They absorbed the code of the world they had been born into, thus Margaret's code, the Windsor Code, the code of endurance and discretion, and they carried it forward into adult lives defined by craft, by privacy, and by a conspicuous absence from the kind of public emotional display that had once made their parents the most watched couple in Britain. The family was now complete. A princess and an earl, a son and a daughter, a palace apartment in Kensington, staff, schedules, the apparatus of royal domestic life humming around them. Margaret hosted, Tony worked. Their drawing room became a place where artists and musicians and actors and establishment figures mingled in a way that felt genuinely new for royal circles. A marriage that seemed to promise the monarchy could modernize without losing its luster. For a few years, the Snowdons looked like what the future might hold if the institution loosened its collar and let talent sit beside title. They attended premieres and gallery openings. They entertained lavishly, filling their Kensington Palace rooms with guests who would not normally have been invited inside the royal perimeter. Photographers, theater directors, ballet dancers, magazine editors, people whose credentials were creative rather than hereditary. Tony's professional circle and Margaret's social position overlapped to produce something genuinely new. A royal household where conversation was sharp, where the arts were taken seriously, where the atmosphere felt modern and alive. Friends from this period would later describe the marriage's early years as genuinely exciting. Two clever, attractive people who shared a physical ease, a taste for irreverence, a love of swimming and ballet, and late night conversation. There was laughter in those rooms, there was intimacy. There were evenings when the Snowdon drawing room felt like the most interesting place in London, and when the couple at its center seemed to prove that royalty and bohemia could coexist without either one being diminished. The children were small and beautiful and photogenic, and the photographs Tony took of his family during this period are among the best he ever made. Tender, informal, lit with the kind of attention that only a man genuinely engaged with his subjects can produce. Those images mattered. They became part of the public narrative of the marriage. They told the country that this was a family built on love and creativity and warmth, and for a time, the images were not a lie. The difficulty would come when the images outlasted the reality they were meant to capture. But underneath the entertaining and the children and the magazine profiles, a geometry was forming that would prove inescapable. Tony kept his career. He photographed for the Sunday Times magazine, worked on documentary films, and spent long hours in his basement workroom at Kensington Palace, a space Margaret rarely entered and where she was not always welcome. He vanished into assignments for days at a time and came back charged with a vitality that domestic life could not match. And upstairs, in the palace apartment, Margaret waited. She waited as she had been trained to wait her entire life, for the engagement, for the audience, for the husband who would return when his real world had finished with him and his dutiful world required his presence. The house argument crystallized everything. Margaret wanted a country home near Sunning Hill, close to her family, embedded in the royal infrastructure that had always surrounded her. Tony wanted Old House on the Newmans estate in Sussex, a place tied to his Messel family, to his mother's world, to childhood memories that had nothing to do with Margaret or her bloodline. She did not want it. She thought it cold and remote. He went ahead with the restoration anyway, pouring time and attention and money into a property that represented his independence, his separate inheritance, his refusal to be absorbed entirely into her world. Old House would later become the place where he entertained friends, worked in peace, and eventually conducted affairs. A second domestic space that existed beyond Margaret's reach and outside her control. The disagreement was never simply about property. It was the marriage rendered in architecture, her need for proximity, for security, for the familiar structures she had been raised inside, set against his need for autonomy, for a self that existed outside the relationship, for rooms that belonged to him alone. By 1964, the year Sarah was born, the competition between them was already audible to anyone standing close enough to hear it. Two people accustomed to commanding every room they entered were now living inside the same household, each needing to be the more vivid presence, each diminished by the other's claim on the same oxygen. Tony had his work, his darkroom, his escapes into assignments that took him away for days and returned him restless and charged with the energy of a world that had nothing to do with Margaret. Margaret had her title, her duties, her schedule of public engagements, and the long hours between them when the apartment at Kensington Palace felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. The imbalance was structural, and it was deepening with every month that passed. He descended to the basement workshop and closed the door. She remained in the rooms above, surrounded by guilt and silence, and the faint awareness that the man she had married for his vitality was already directing that vitality elsewhere. And in that image, the photographer disappearing into his own world below, while the princess sits alone in the gilded, quiet above, the house divided not by argument but by architecture, lay everything that was about to go wrong. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. It did not happen all at once. That is part of what made it so devastating. For Margaret, for the children, and eventually for the institution that had sanctioned the marriage and now had to manage its disintegration. The Snowdon marriage did not explode. It corroded. And corrosion by its nature is invisible until the structure it has been eating gives way. Because before the basement became a symbol of distance, it was also something simpler, a workroom. And the work Tony did in it was serious. His photographs for the Sunday Times magazine were not society fluff. He shot assignments across the world, Documentary pieces on poverty, on disability, on communities the readers of a Sunday supplement might never otherwise have encountered. He made a television film about loneliness among the elderly that was broadcast by the BBC and was, by most critical accounts, genuinely affecting. His professional reputation during the 1960s was not borrowed from Margaret's name. It was earned, image by image, assignment by assignment, in the tradition of photojournalists who believed the camera could do more than flatter the powerful. There was real substance in Tony's career, and Margaret, to her credit, recognized it. She was proud of his work. She understood what it cost him to be taken seriously as a photographer, rather than dismissed as a princess's husband, and in the early years she supported that ambition, with a generosity that her later bitterness would sometimes obscure. The difficulty was not that Tony worked. The difficulty was what his work meant about the marriage's internal economy. Every assignment took him away from Kensington Palace, physically, emotionally, psychologically. He left the apartment charged with purpose and returned from the field with stories, contacts, the restless energy of someone who had been doing something that mattered. Margaret, meanwhile, had her own calendar. The opening of a hospital wing, a charity luncheon, a reception at which she would be expected to make conversation with people she had not chosen and would never see again. Her duties were real, but they were not chosen, and they carried none of the creative satisfaction that Tony's work gave him. She opened things, she visited things, she wore the right dress and said the right words and sat in the right chair and was driven home afterward to an apartment where the most interesting person in her life was in the basement doing something that did not include her. But none of that was yet a crisis. In the early and middle 1960s, the Snowdons were still, to the world and even partly to themselves, the couple the nation had fallen in love with on their wedding day. Their social life was extraordinary by any measure. The apartment at Kensington Palace hosted evenings where Peter Sellers might be sitting next to a cabinet minister, where a ballet dancer might share a sofa with an earl, where the conversation was quick and the cigarette smoke was thick and the sense of being at the intersection of culture and power was palpable. Margaret was a superb hostess, witty, sharp, sometimes cruel in ways that made people nervous, but more often generous in ways that made them feel included. Tony was the gravitational center of any room he occupied, funny, provocative, capable of making the most reserved guest feel that they were being let in on a private joke. Together, they were formidable. Separately, and this is the detail that matters, each was slightly less vivid, slightly less complete, as though the marriage, for all its gathering tensions, was still producing something neither could manufacture alone. Their social circle was not merely decorative, it was a genuine intersection of worlds that had rarely overlapped in British life with such ease. Through Tony, Margaret had access to artists, designers, photographers, actors, and filmmakers who saw the world through a creative lens rather than a hereditary one. Through Margaret, Tony had access to institutional power, diplomatic receptions, the social infrastructure of the monarchy, and the particular prestige that came with being married to one of the most famous women in the world. Each gave the other a dimension they lacked, and the fact that this exchange worked, that it produced evenings of genuine pleasure and a public image of genuine glamour, and is what made the coming disintegration so painful. What was lost was not merely a marriage. It was a version of what British life could look like when talent and title were not mutually suspicious. Margaret herself was not a passive ornament in this cultural world. She played piano with real competence. She sang, not in the polite, accomplishment-level way that aristocratic women were expected to sing, but with genuine musicality and conviction. She had opinions about theater, about design, about the visual arts that were informed and sometimes incisive. Tony respected that side of her, at least initially, and she respected his work with a seriousness that other members of the royal family could not quite match. There was a period, and brief, measured in a few years, rather than a decade. Not when the marriage functioned as a genuine creative partnership, each sharpening the other, each making the other more interesting than they would have been alone. That period is crucial to the story because it establishes what was real before the damage began. The audience needs to believe that something valuable existed before it can feel the weight of what was lost. The public face of the Snowdons during these years was dazzling. They were photographed at the ballet, at film premieres, at charity galas, at country weekends with the sort of guests who made other hosts envious. Tony's photographs of Margaret from this era are among the most beautiful images of any member of the royal family ever produced. Intimate, tender, lit with a knowledge of her face and her body that only a husband could possess. Those photographs entered the public imagination and stayed there. They became the reference point against which everything that followed would be measured. This is what the marriage looked like when it was good, and this is therefore the scale of what was destroyed. Mystique was already beginning to figure in their lives, though it had not yet become the symbol it would later be. Margaret's friend Colin Tennant, Anne Glenconnor's husband, had given her a plot of land on the island as a wedding present, and by the late 1960s, Margaret was beginning to visit with regularity. The house she would build there, Les Jolies Hauts, would not be completed until 1973, but the island was already functioning as something important in the emotional architecture of her life. A place that was not Kensington Palace, not a royal engagement, not a room in which she was expected to perform. On Mustique, Margaret swam and sunbathed and drank and stayed up late and allowed herself to be, for a few days at a time, a woman rather than a title. Tony did not always accompany her. The island was hers in a way that very few things in her marriage were, and that separation, his work, her island, was already drawing the outline of lives that would eventually diverge entirely. There is something worth noting about how this particular kind of marriage fails, because it did not follow the pattern people expect when they hear the word affair or the word cruelty. Tony did not come home one night and announce he was leaving. Margaret did not discover a single devastating betrayal and decide to end things. What happened was slower, quieter, and in many ways more destructive. The marriage died the way a room goes cold when someone leaves the window open overnight. Gradually, imperceptibly, until the chill is everywhere and no one can remember when the warmth stopped. The first signs were atmospheric. Tony's absences grew longer. His returns grew more perfunctory. The basement workroom, which had once been a place of creative energy that Margaret could admire from a distance, became a barrier, a closed door between them, a physical boundary that Tony enforced with increasing rigidity. When Margaret came downstairs to find him, she was sent back up. That detail, reported in later biographical accounts, is small enough to seem trivial and important enough to deserve attention, because it captures the particular cruelty of a marriage in which one person is told repeatedly and without explanation that they are not wanted. Margaret was not being screamed at. She was not being struck. She was being dismissed, and the dismissal came from a man she had married precisely because he had once made her feel more wanted than anyone else ever had. The notes began. Tony had a habit, and this is attested in Lady Anne Glenconnor's memoir-based reporting and repeated across multiple biographical accounts, of leaving written insults in places where only Margaret would find them. Inside books, in drawers, tucked among her gloves or her stationery. The content of at least one, as later described in reporting drawn from Glenconnor's account, was vicious. A message telling her she looked like a Jewish manicurist and that he hated her. The phrasing was calculated to wound on multiple levels: her vanity, her sense of her own appearance, her identity as a princess who was supposed to be above such indignities. But the method was worse than the content. These were not insults hurled in the heat of an argument, where anger at least acknowledges the other person's presence and significance. They were ambushes. They were designed to be discovered in private, in quiet moments, when Margaret was alone with her own thoughts and her husband was elsewhere. The cruelty was not impulsive. It was architectural. Tony constructed humiliations and left them in her domestic space like traps. And the cumulative effect was to make her feel unsafe in her own home. Try to imagine that for a moment. The Princess of the United Kingdom, one of the most photographed women in the world, opening a drawer in Kensington Palace and finding among her own belongings a note from her husband telling her he hated her. The dissonance is the point. All that ceremony, all that security, all those staff and aides and private secretaries and equerries, and still there was no protection against the person closest to her. The palace could manage her schedule, her public appearances, her wardrobe, and her engagements. It could not manage what happened inside her marriage, because the marriage was supposed to be the one space where management was not required, where she was not Princess Margaret performing a role, but Margaret living a life. Tony turned that space into a theater of contempt, and she had no audience to appeal to and no protocol for how to survive it. The affairs followed, or perhaps ran alongside the notes. The chronology of a disintegrating marriage is never as clean as biographers would like it to be. What the biographical record makes clear is that Tony's infidelities during this period were numerous. sustained, and conducted with a boldness that suggested he was not especially concerned about being discovered. He maintained relationships with women from his pre-Margaret life. He formed new attachments. He exercised the sexual freedom he had always claimed as his right, and he did so within a marriage whose institutional constraints made it almost impossible for Margaret to respond in kind without triggering a public scandal. The most devastating single scene from this phase, and the one that crystallized everything and turned private suspicion into visible humiliation, took place at the London clinic. Tony was hospitalized, and Margaret, still his wife, still operating within the structure of concern that marriage demanded, came to visit him. She arrived to find Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs already there, already at his bedside, already occupying the position that should have been Margaret's. The scene, as later reported, is painful in its specificity. Margaret, standing in a hospital room, confronted with the physical evidence of her own displacement, reportedly said something to the effect that she could nurse him herself. A line that is devastating precisely because it sounds not furious but plaintive, not commanding but diminished. A princess of the blood, the sister of the queen, reduced to competing for access to her own husband's sickbed. The antiseptic light of a hospital room, the institutional smell, the terrible ordinariness of a woman being told without words that she is no longer the most important person in her husband's life. That scene is the first fracture, not because it was the first betrayal, but because it was the first moment when the betrayal became impossible to reinterpret as anything else. Margaret absorbed it. That is what Margaret had been trained to do. She absorbed the hospital humiliation the way she had absorbed the Townsend renunciation, with control, with pride, with a refusal to collapse that was simultaneously her greatest strength and her most costly inheritance. The Windsor Code, one does not speak, one does not seen, one endures, had been bred into her since childhood. It was the only response she knew, and it was the response the institution required. A princess sobbing in public about her husband's infidelity would have been a crisis. A princess carrying her humiliation privately was, in the palace's calculus, merely a difficulty. Elizabeth knew. Of course Elizabeth knew, not necessarily the specific details of the London clinic scene, but the broad contours of what was happening inside her sister's marriage. The Queen was not a woman who missed things. She had access to information, to staff reports, to the quiet observations of courtiers, whose job it was to notice when the royal household's foundations were shifting. But knowing and acting are different things when you are the sovereign, and Elizabeth's position was structurally impossible. She could not intervene in Margaret's marriage without acknowledging that the marriage was failing, and acknowledging the failure publicly would create the very crisis that royal protocol existed to prevent. So Elizabeth watched. She sympathized in the private, constrained way that royal sympathy is expressed. A telephone call, a concerned word to a lady-in-waiting, an invitation to Balmoral that carried the unspoken subtext of refuge. But she did not, and perhaps could not, offer Margaret the one thing that might have made a difference: permission to leave. The Queen Mother, too, maintained her position. She adored Margaret, had always adored Margaret, but she belonged to a generation for which marital unhappiness was not a reason for divorce, but a reason for better behavior at dinner. She had seen her own parents' generation endure difficult marriages with grace and silence. She had survived a world war, the abdication crisis, her husband's death, and the transformation of the monarchy into a media institution, all without losing her composure or her conviction that the appearance of stability was itself a form of duty. If Margaret had come to her mother and described the notes in the drawers, the humiliation at the hospital, the slow accumulation of contempt, and it is not clear whether she ever did in explicit terms, the Queen Mother's response would almost certainly have been sympathy, laced with the expectation of endurance. One bears it, one carries on, one does not allow private misery to become public spectacle. But something shifted after the London clinic. Not publicly. There was no announcement, no confrontation reported to staff, no formal acknowledgement of what Margaret had seen and what it meant. The shift was internal. Margaret began to harden in ways that friends and associates would later describe with varying degrees of sympathy. Her wit, always sharp, developed an edge that could draw blood. Her drinking increased. Her social life became more frenetic, as though filling every evening with guests and laughter and music could compensate for what was missing during the hours when the guests went home and the apartment fell silent. She did not leave Tony. She could not leave Tony. Not yet. Not without triggering the constitutional and institutional consequences that her sister's government would have to manage. So she stayed and she adapted. And the adaptation took the form of endurance, laced with increasing bitterness. And then she began to look elsewhere. Not immediately, not recklessly, but with the slow, almost inevitable gravitational pull of a woman who has been starved of tenderness and finds herself in the company of men who are willing to provide it. The biographical record names Anthony Barton, a Bordeaux wine merchant, and Robin Douglas Home, a pianist and nephew of a former prime minister, among Margaret's attachments during this period. These were not casual flings in the way Tony's serial conquests were casual. They were attempts, clumsy, sometimes desperate, always constrained by Margaret's position, to recover something that the marriage had destroyed. The feeling of being desired, valued, seen as a woman rather than an institution. And here the story demands a distinction that the tabloid version of these events has never been interested in making. Tony's affairs and Margaret's affairs were not equivalent. The arithmetic of infidelity? He did it, she did it, they were both unfaithful. Obscures a fundamental asymmetry in motive, in power, and in consequence. Tony's affairs were exercises of appetite. He pursued women because he wanted them, because conquest was his habit, because sexual novelty was the fuel his restlessness required. He conducted them with a confidence that bordered on indifference to discovery, because he understood, correctly, that the institutional machinery surrounding his wife would protect him from the full consequences of exposure, and that Margaret's attachments were something else entirely. They were acts of survival. Each man she turned to represented not a thrill, but a rescue. A brief respite from the daily experience of being married to someone who had made it clear, in notes and absences and closed doors, that she was unwanted. That distinction does not excuse the pain her affairs caused. It caused pain to the men involved, to the children, to the image of the family. But it does explain the emotional logic, and the emotional logic matters if the story is to be honest about who these people were. Robin Douglas Home's story carries a particular weight because his relationship with Margaret did not end cleanly. He was a fragile man, charming but unsteady, talented but unable to sustain the momentum his talent should have generated. His connection with Margaret was intense and, for a time, genuinely tender, but it could not survive the pressures of her position. And after the relationship ended, Douglas Home spiraled into depression that would years later contribute to his death by suicide. Margaret was not responsible for that death, but the knowledge that a man who had loved her had ended his life in despair added another layer of guilt and grief to a woman who was already carrying more than she could comfortably bear. None of this was public. None of this was discussed. The palace's machinery of discretion ensured that Margaret's private pain remained private, and the cost of that privacy was that she bore it essentially alone. Tony, meanwhile, was not merely conducting affairs. He was constructing parallel lives. Old house at Nyman's, the Sussex property Margaret had never wanted and he had restored against her wishes, had become a second domestic world, a place where he entertained friends, worked, and conducted relationships beyond Margaret's knowledge or control. The fry thread remained quietly present. Polly, born in 1960, was growing up as Jeremy Fry's acknowledged daughter, but the truth of her paternity, that Tony was her biological father, lay buried beneath decades of social convention and the mutual interest of everyone involved in not asking questions, whose answers might be inconvenient. Tony's capacity for compartmentalization was remarkable. He could be the charming dinner guest at Kensington Palace on a Tuesday and the attentive lover at a separate address on a Wednesday, and the wall between those versions of himself appeared to cause him no visible distress. It was the people around him, the women, the children, the wife, who absorbed the cost of his flexibility. The marriage was now a private war. It was not yet a public scandal because the machinery of royal discretion was still functioning, because the press of the 1960s and early 70s operated under different rules than it would a decade later, and because both Margaret and Tony had their own reasons for maintaining the facade. Margaret's reasons were institutional. Divorce would mean constitutional difficulty, public humiliation, the failure of the freedom she had claimed after Townsend. Tony's reasons were more practical. The marriage gave him access, status, a title, a position in the world that his talent alone, brilliant as it was, could not have secured. Neither could afford to be the one who broke the surface. So they continued smiling at public engagements, hosting their famous evenings, appearing in photographs that showed a couple whose marriage was lively and unconventional, while behind the camera, the notes piled up in drawers and the cruelty accumulated in the rooms where no one was watching. The children were watching, of course. David was old enough by the late 1960s to register the atmospheres, even if he could not yet name them. He was 7, 8, 9 years old, the age at which children begin to understand that the silence between their parents is not peace, but its opposite. The age at which a closed door or a raised voice or the sudden departure of a father for a weekend in Sussex carries meanings that do not need to be explained. Sarah, younger by 3 years, absorbed what children always absorb. Not the specifics of adult conflict, but its emotional weather. The tension in a room when both parents are present, the relief when one of them leaves, the particular quality of silence that follows an argument conducted in whispers behind a closed door. They lived in Kensington Palace, surrounded by nannies and staff, and the strange formality of a royal household, and they watched their parents' marriage unravel from the inside with the helpless clarity that only children possess. Neither child has spoken publicly, in any sustained or detailed way, about what growing up in this household was like. That silence has held for more than 50 years, and it is perhaps the most telling inheritance they received. The Windsor Code of Discretion, learned not from instruction, but from necessity, absorbed not through duty, but through self-preservation. The shape of their adult lives tells its own story. David's turn toward furniture making and design, the precision of joints, the integrity of materials, the satisfaction of building something solid and functional and beautiful, suggest a man who sought in craft what his childhood could not provide: order, reliability, things that held together. Sarah's commitment to painting, quiet hours in a studio, the private conversation between artist and canvas, the deliberate avoidance of public spectacle, suggests a woman who found in art what the family name could not give her, a space that belonged to her alone. Both chose vocation that prized quiet mastery over public performance, and that choice, whether conscious or instinctive, reads like a generational correction. Their parents had lived their marriage as theater. The children would spend their adult lives avoiding the stage. By the early 1970s, the marriage existed in a state of arms suspension. Tony had his work, his lovers, his compartments. Margaret had her duties, her drinking, her slow accretion of private sorrow. The palace maintained its discretion. The press, not yet equipped with the invasive reach it would develop in the late 70s and 80s, reported on the Snowdons as a glamorous, if unconventional couple, and left the rest alone. And into this suspended world, sometime around 1973, a new figure began to move. Younger, lighter, kinder, offering Margaret something she had not felt in years. His name was Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25 years old to Margaret's 43. He was handsome in a soft, unthreatening way that was the precise opposite of Tony's angular, electric charisma. He was not an artist of Tony's caliber. He was not a man of great professional ambition or intellectual intensity. He was a would-be landscape gardener, the son of a Welsh baronet, a man whose principal gifts were charm, warmth, and uncomplicated physical beauty, and the ability to make Margaret feel, for the first time in years, that someone was paying attention to her, not because she was a princess, but because she was a person who deserved kindness. Their first meeting, arranged through mutual friends in the social circle that orbited Mustique and the London party world, was unremarkable. Their second and third meetings were less so. Roddy was unthreatening in the ways that were precisely what Margaret needed after years of Tony's emotional warfare. He did not compete with her, did not test her, did not use his intelligence as a weapon. He simply liked her and he let her know it. And for a woman who had spent a decade being told in 100 small ways that she was hateful and unwanted, that simple liking was powerful enough to break through every caution her position should have imposed. By the time Margaret invited him to Les Jolies Eaux on Mustique, the relationship had crossed whatever invisible line separates friendship from attachment. They swam together, they sat in the sun together, they stayed up late together on a terrace overlooking the Caribbean, drinking and talking and existing in a version of Margaret's life that had nothing to do with Kensington Palace or the palace machine or the husband who left notes in her drawers. It was an affair conducted in paradise, and for Margaret it felt, briefly and dangerously, like the freedom she had been promised when she married Tony 15 years earlier and had never actually received. But Roddy was also, and this must be said plainly, a symptom. He was the mirror image of what Tony had once been: vivid, flattering, an answer to humiliation, except that where Tony had offered danger and brilliance, Roddy offered gentleness and simplicity. Margaret reached for him not because she had found a great love, but because she was drowning, and he was the nearest solid thing. The parallel to her earlier life was exact and cruel. Once again, she had chosen a man who existed outside the usual royal orbit. Once again, the relationship carried the risk of institutional disapproval, and once again, Margaret's private desire was on a collision course with her public position. She had learned nothing, the unsympathetic observer might say. But perhaps the truer reading is that she had learned everything. Learned that institutional compliance brought her Townsend's loss, learned that institutional approval brought her Tony's cruelty, and had simply decided this time to reach for comfort regardless of the cost. The institution that had managed her unhappiness for more than a decade was about to discover that it could not manage this. Because Roddy was not a discreet arrangement conducted behind closed doors in London. Roddy was mystique and sunshine and a young man's arm around a princess on a beach where the light was good and the sightlines were long. Sooner or later, someone was going to take a photograph. And when that photograph appeared, the careful architecture of silence that had kept this marriage standing for 16 years, the discretion, the management, the unspoken agreement between the palace and the press that some things were simply not reported, would collapse in the space of a single published image. The private war was about to become public, and neither Margaret nor Tony, nor the institution that contained them both, was ready for what would happen next. The photograph was taken in February 1976 on the island of Mustique, in the kind of light that makes the Caribbean look like paradise. And it did exactly what photographs do when they capture something the establishment has spent years pretending does not exist. It made the private irrevocable. The image itself was not dramatic. Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn, together, in swimwear, on a beach, in the Caribbean sunshine. No embrace, no kiss, nothing that would have scandalized a viewer who did not know who these people were. But the viewer did know. Everyone knew. The woman in the photograph was Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, youngest sister of the Queen, married, a mother, a member of the most visible family in the world. The man beside her was not her husband. He was 17 years her junior, untitled, unknown to most of the British public, and very obviously not there in any capacity that could be explained away as professional or platonic. The photograph was published by the News of the World, and within hours the careful architecture of discretion that had held the Snowdon marriage together in public, years of silence, of managed appearances, of institutional tact, lay in pieces. But that photograph did not appear out of nowhere. It was the detonation point of a chain of events that had been building since Margaret first allowed herself to feel something for Roddy, and to understand what it meant that she was allowing herself to feel it. To trace that chain properly, you have to go back to the months before the photograph, to the period when the Snowdon marriage entered its final, most destructive phase, and when the lives of everyone connected to it began to diverge in ways that could no longer be managed, disguised, or absorbed by the institution that contained them. By 1974, Tony had perfected compartmentalization to a degree that would have been impressive if it had not been so destructive. He maintained his professional life with undimmed energy, the photography, the design work, the documentary projects, the public reputation as a man of serious creative accomplishment. He maintained his social life with the charm and wit that had always made him welcome in any room. He maintained his marriage, or at least the public performance of his marriage, with sufficient regularity that the press could photograph the Snowdons together at an official engagement and publish the image without irony. And alongside all of these, he maintained a private life of extraordinary complexity. Women whose names circulated in the social world Margaret and Tony shared, relationships that were open secrets among friends and closed books to the wider public, and at the center of it all, a deepening attachment to Lucy Lindsay Hogg that would within a few years become the next marriage. Lucy was not a fling. She was an arrangement, a woman Tony was building a life with even as the formal structure of his existing life remained nominally intact. She was the former wife of the film director Michael Lindsay Hogg, socially well-connected, attractive, and willing to occupy the position that Tony's compartmentalized existence required, the woman who waited in the space his marriage did not fill. Their relationship had been developing quietly for some time, and by the mid-70s it had acquired the weight and permanence of a second domestic establishment. Tony did not see this as contradiction. He saw it as management. He was a man who had always believed he could have everything: the title, the career, the wife, the freedom, the lovers. And for years, the belief had been confirmed by the system he operated within. Royal discretion protected him. Margaret's endurance sustained him. The press's restraint shielded him. He had found a way to live exactly as he wished without paying the full cost of any of his choices, and if the arrangement was cruel to Margaret, that cruelty was, in Tony's internal accounting, simply the price of his autonomy. Margaret, meanwhile, was moving in the opposite direction, not toward more compartments, but toward fewer, not toward complexity, but toward a narrowing world in which the options for happiness or even relief were shrinking year by year. Her drinking had increased. That fact appears consistently across the biographical record and should be stated plainly. Margaret drank more as her marriage worsened, and the drinking was both symptom and accelerant, dulling the pain of her domestic reality while simultaneously making her more volatile, more unpredictable, more difficult for the people around her to manage. She smoked heavily. Her cigarette holder became almost a parody of the glamour it had once represented, a prop from a life that was no longer glamorous, but merely endured. Her public engagements continued, but friends and staff observed a change in her manner. The wit was still there, but it had curdled into something sharper and less generous, the famous charm now interspersed with outbursts of imperious temper that made people wary. She was not well. That is the simplest and most important thing to say about Margaret in this period. She was not well emotionally. She was not managing the stress of her life with the resilience she had once possessed, and the systems that should have supported her family, her household, the institution itself, were designed to manage appearances rather than treat causes. The palace did not have a mechanism for acknowledging that a princess was unhappy. It had a mechanism for ensuring that her unhappiness did not become visible. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the space in which Margaret suffered. Her daily life at Kensington Palace had acquired a particular rhythm that friends found alarming. She rose late, sometimes not until 11 or noon, a habit that Tony had mocked and that the press would later seize upon as evidence of indolence. She smoked from the moment she was awakened, the cigarette holder that had once been an emblem of glamour, now seeming more like a lifeline than an accessory. Her evenings were long and often fueled by whiskey, and the line between social drinking and something more solitary and more desperate was becoming harder for the people around her to locate. She could still be magnificent in company, the wit, the musicality, the capacity to hold a room, but the performances were more effortful now, and the crashes that followed them, the mornings after when the palace apartment felt emptier and quieter than any room in London had a right to feel, were becoming harder to conceal. Her relationship with Roddy was deepening in ways that were both sustaining and dangerous. He visited her in London. She invited him to Mustique. They appeared together at small private gatherings, where the other guests understood the nature of the relationship and maintained the silence that their social world expected. Roddy was not equipped, temperamentally or practically, to be the partner of a princess. He lacked the ambition, the professional gravity, the social armor that such a position required. But he gave Margaret something that no one else in her life was providing: uncomplicated affection. He did not compete with her. He did not resent her rank. He did not leave notes in her drawers. He simply liked being with her, and in the emotional desert of her marriage, that simple liking was enough to make her take risks that her position could not afford. Mustique became her refuge and her stage simultaneously. Les Jolies Eaux, the house that had been completed in 1973 on the plot Colin Tennant had given her as a wedding present, was by now a fully realized domestic space. Her space, in a way that Kensington Palace had never been, with its own rhythm and its own rules and its own social world. On Mustique, Margaret could swim and sunbathe and drink rum punches and stay up until 3 in the morning listening to music and dancing and being for a few weeks at a time, liberated from the protocol and the staff and the grey London schedule that defined her existence for the rest of the year. The island was not merely a holiday destination. It was a psychological necessity. The one place where Margaret could experience something approximating freedom, where the surveillance was lighter, where the expectations were suspended, where she could be a woman in the sun rather than a princess in the rain. But Mustique was also a trap, because the privacy it offered was an illusion. The island was small. The social circle was gossipy. The staff at Les Jolies Eaux included local workers who had no particular loyalty to the British monarchy's code of silence. And Margaret, buoyed by the relief of being away from London and the warmth of Roddy's company, was not as careful as her position demanded. She and Roddy were visible together. They dined together. They appeared in public on the island with an ease that suggested they were not merely friends. The photograph that would change everything was not taken by a paparazzo hiding in the bushes. It was taken by someone who was present on the island and who understood, presumably, the commercial value of what they were seeing. The publication of that photograph in February 1976 was a different kind of event from anything the Snowdon marriage had previously produced. Previous crises had been private, known to family, to friends, to the inner circle, but not to the public at large. The London clinic scene had been witnessed by staff, but not reported. Tony's affairs had been open secrets in social circles, but had not reached the newspapers. Margaret's attachments had been conducted with sufficient discretion that the palace's machinery could manage the whispers. But the Mustique photograph was none of those things. It was public, it was printed, it was seen by millions, and it was, in the language of the institution, unmanageable. The palace's response was what the palace's response always was in moments of crisis: silence, followed by the minimum possible acknowledgement, followed by an attempt to move on as quickly as possible. But this time the silence could not hold, because the photograph had given the press a story that could not be unwritten, and because the rules of engagement between the monarchy and Fleet Street was shifting beneath the institution's feet. The deferential press culture that had protected the royal family for decades, the unwritten understanding that certain aspects of royal private life were not reported, was eroding. Editors were becoming bolder. The appetite for royal scandal was growing. And the Mustique photograph, once published, opened a door that could not be closed. If Margaret's affair could be shown, what else might be photographed, printed, discussed? Within the palace itself, the mood was one of controlled alarm. Senior courtiers understood that the separation, long anticipated in private, would now have to become public. The question was not whether but when, and in what language, and with what degree of choreography. The machinery began to move. Private secretaries consulted one another. Constitutional implications were reviewed, not because a royal separation was technically unconstitutional, but because the precedent it set would reverberate through the institution for decades to come. The Queen was briefed. The Prime Minister was informed. And somewhere in the bureaucratic space between Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, the language of an official statement began to take shape. Tony, sensing perhaps that the balance of public sympathy had shifted against Margaret, or seizing an opportunity that the photograph had created, or simply ready at last to formalize what had been true in practice for years, moved towards separation, with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. He had Lucy. He had his career. He had a life outside the marriage that was fully constructed and ready to occupy. All he needed was the exit, and the Mustique photograph had provided it. The timing was convenient. The optics were favorable. Margaret was the one who had been photographed with another man. In the public narrative, she was the transgressor. Tony could leave the marriage with his reputation largely intact, which is precisely what he did. Anne Glenconner watched all of this from closer range than almost anyone. She had been with Margaret on Mustique. She had seen the relationship with Roddy develop. She had observed the toll that years of Tony's cruelty had taken on her friend. And she had also seen with the clear eye of a woman who loved Margaret but was not blind to her faults, that the affair with Roddy was not merely therapeutic but reckless. Anne understood the institution. She understood what the photograph would mean. And she understood, with the particular sadness of a witness who can see the disaster approaching and cannot prevent it, that Margaret's pursuit of happiness was about to become the instrument of her public humiliation. The ironies multiplied, and they were not the gentle ironies of coincidence, but the savage ironies of a system that had been designed to protect the powerful and was now punishing the person who had been least protected all along. Margaret, who had sacrificed Peter Townsend to protect the monarchy's image, was now the person whose behavior threatened that image. Margaret, who had endured Tony's far more numerous and far more deliberate infidelities in silence for over a decade, was now the one whose single visible attachment was being treated as a scandal. Margaret, who had been taught from childhood that duty came before desire, was now being punished for acting on desire in a way that her husband had been acting for years, without consequence. And Margaret, who had never chosen to be royal, who had been born into the institution rather than joining it voluntarily, was now bearing the institutional cost of a marriage that the institution had sanctioned and then failed to protect her within. The asymmetry was savage, and Margaret felt it acutely. She was not naive about what was happening. She knew that the photograph had shifted the public narrative against her. She knew that Tony would use it. She knew that the institution would need to respond. And she knew, with the bitter clarity of someone who had been inside the machinery for 46 years, that the response would prioritize the monarchy's reputation over her own. Anne Glenconner was beside her through the worst of it. The lady-in-waiting who had watched the marriage deteriorate from its earliest years now watched its end approach with the particular anguish of a witness who understood both the public stakes and the private ones. Anne had seen the notes. She had seen the dismissals. She had sat with Margaret through evenings when the princess's composure cracked and the reality of her situation, married to a man who despised her, trapped by an institution that valued her image more than her well-being, surfaced in tears or in rage or in the quiet, devastating admission that she did not know how to continue. Anne's testimony, rendered in her later memoir-based accounts, is the closest thing the historical record possesses to an interior view of Margaret's suffering during this period, specific, detailed, grounded in the physical realities of palace life, and suffused with the kind of empathy that only a long and intimate friendship can produce. The weeks between the photograph's publication and the formal announcement of the separation were, by all accounts, grim. The atmosphere at Kensington Palace was one of barely suppressed crisis. Tony and Margaret were still technically sharing the apartment, though their lives within it had long since separated into parallel tracks that intersected only when unavoidable. Tony was in contact with his solicitors. Margaret was in contact with hers. Conversations that should have taken place between husband and wife were instead conducted through intermediaries. A private secretary here, a legal advisor there, the institutional buffer that the royal household provided and that spared both parties the indignity of direct confrontation, but also denied them any possibility of honest reckoning. The palace was engaged in the particular kind of choreographed communication that the British establishment performs, when a situation that has been quietly deteriorating for years suddenly becomes a matter of public record. There were telephone calls between private secretaries across multiple royal residences. There were consultations with senior courtiers. There were discussions, careful and coded, about the language that would be used in any public statement and about the constitutional implications of what was about to happen. A royal separation had not occurred in the Queen's reign. A royal divorce, if it came to that, would represent a breach in the continuity the monarchy had maintained throughout the post-war era. A breach that the establishment understood would be measured not in legal terms, but in symbolic ones. The family that was supposed to represent stability, endurance, and the permanence of traditional values was about to announce, publicly, that one of its most prominent marriages had failed. The institution was entering territory it had no modern playbook for navigating. David was 14. Sarah was 11. They were at school, living the bifurcated lives of children whose parents occupied the intersection of public celebrity and private dysfunction. Whatever they were told, and the record is silent on what exactly the children were told and by whom, they would have understood, with the intuition of adolescence, that their family was breaking apart in a way that was not merely personal but national. Their father's name was in the newspapers. Their mother's name was in the newspapers. The photograph of their mother with a man who was not their father had been seen by everyone they knew. The particular cruelty of being the children of famous parents in a moment of public crisis is that there is no private space in which to process the shame. Every classmate, every teacher, every friend's parent has seen the headline, and the child must navigate a world that knows more about their family's failure than the family has ever voluntarily disclosed. Tony made the decisive move. In March of 1976, not through a personal conversation with his wife, not across a kitchen table or in a drawing room, but through the institutional machinery that now mediated every aspect of their relationship, the message was delivered. Margaret's private secretary, Lord Nigel Napier, placed a telephone call to the princess. Think about that for a moment. A husband ending a marriage of 16 years, and the news arrives not from the husband himself, but from a private secretary on the telephone. The mediation tells you everything about what the relationship had become. The content of the call, as later reported, was simple and unadorned. Lord Snowdon wished to end the marriage. Margaret's response, according to the biographical account that has entered the public record, was dry and devastating. She reportedly told Napier that it was the best news he had ever given her. That line deserves a moment's attention because it carries the weight of everything this story has been building toward. It is not a line of grief. It is not a line of anger. It is a line of relief, the exhausted, bitter, almost comedic relief of a woman who has been trapped in a burning building for 16 years and has just been told she is allowed to leave. The marriage had become so unbearable, the cruelty so corrosive, The daily texture of life inside it so poisonous that the end of it was not a tragedy, but a liberation. And the fact that even this liberation came to Margaret not directly, not from husband to wife, but through the palace system, secretary to secretary, institution mediating between two people who could no longer speak to each other, tells you everything about what the marriage had become. It had started as a love affair and ended as an administrative procedure. The formal announcement came on the 19th of March, 1976. The language was palace language, precise, bloodless, designed to convey information without emotion and to close down inquiry rather than invite it. The couple had mutually agreed to live apart. There were no plans for divorce proceedings. The statement used the word mutually, which was technically accurate in that both parties had, by this point, accepted the reality of the situation, and deeply misleading in that it implied a symmetry of decision-making that did not exist. Tony had wanted out. Margaret had been told she was being left. The institution had drafted the language. The press officer had distributed it, and the public read it in their morning newspapers and drew their own conclusions, which were largely that Margaret, glamorous, difficult, indiscreet Margaret, had brought this upon herself by conducting an affair with a younger man in the Caribbean, while her husband was elsewhere, being patient and long-suffering. The statement occupied a few column inches. 16 years of a marriage, of love and cruelty and children and notes and drawers and hospital bedsides and parallel lovers and institutional silence, reduced to a paragraph of diplomatic prose. That compression is itself part of the story. The palace's language was a final act of management. Take a catastrophe, strip it of texture, remove the human beings, and present what remains as an administrative matter. Mutually agreed, live apart, no plans for divorce. Every word chosen to minimize the damage to the institution, not a single word chosen to acknowledge what the marriage had actually been. That narrative was unjust, and Margaret knew it was unjust, and the knowledge that the public version of her marriage's collapse bore almost no resemblance to the private reality was a wound that would not heal. She had endured years of Tony's cruelty. The notes, the lovers, the humiliations, the hospital bedside, the slow dismantling of her confidence. And the public believed she was the unfaithful one. She had been the one left, and the public believed she had been the one leaving. The gap between perception and reality was vast, and it was a gap the institution had no interest in closing, because closing it would have required acknowledging what had actually happened inside the marriage, and that acknowledgement would have been far more damaging to the monarchy's image than the neat managed story of a mutual separation. The threads were now diverging with a finality that could not be disguised. Tony moved toward Lucy and the life he had been constructing in parallel for years. He was, by all accounts, relieved. The marriage had been a constraint, and constraints were what Tony had spent his entire life refusing. With the separation formalized, he could live openly with Lucy, continue his professional career, without the complicated scheduling that a royal wife demanded, and begin the process of reinventing himself. Not as the Earl of Snowdon who had failed Princess Margaret, but as the artist and photographer who had outgrown a marriage that was never going to contain him. His energy was undiminished, his charm was intact, his capacity for moving forward without looking back, without guilt, without sustained reflection, without the kind of emotional accounting that other people might have found necessary after 16 years of a marriage they had helped to destroy, was remarkable, and to those who loved Margaret, infuriating. Margaret remained at Kensington Palace, publicly humiliated, privately devastated beneath the performance of resilience. Her relationship with Roddy continued, but it was now stripped of the privacy that had made it bearable. Every appearance together was noted. Every holiday was scrutinized. The press, which had once treated Margaret with a mixture of affection and deference, now treated her with a prurience that fed on the Mustique photograph and showed no signs of abating. She was becoming, in the public imagination, a figure of pity and censure in equal measure. The princess who had thrown it all away for a younger man, the royal who drank too much and stayed out too late, the sister who embarrassed the queen. That characterization was unjust, but injustice, once it enters the bloodstream of public opinion, is almost impossible to extract. Roddy himself was struggling under the weight of the attention. He had never sought fame. He had not entered Margaret's life with the intention of becoming a tabloid fixture. He was a young man with modest ambitions and an agreeable disposition who had stumbled into the orbit of one of the most scrutinized women in the world, and the scrutiny was more than he was equipped to handle. He would later attempt a recording career and various horticultural ventures, but the defining fact of his public life would always be that he had been Princess Margaret's lover, a label that reduced a complex human being to a single scandalous footnote. The relationship would eventually run its course, not because of any dramatic rupture, but because the pressure surrounding it, the press, the palace, the sheer impossibility of building a normal life inside such abnormal circumstances eroded it gradually, the way the sea erodes a cliff face, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. The children absorbed the institutional earthquake of their parents' separation alongside the personal one. David, 14, was at boarding school, navigating a world in which his family's dissolution was not merely a household matter, but a national event discussed on the evening news and debated by members of parliament. Sarah, 11, was younger, but no less aware. Children at that age understand more than adults wish to acknowledge, and the Armstrong-Jones children would have understood, with painful clarity, that their family had become a public spectacle in which their mother was cast as the villain and their father as the wronged party, a casting that bore little resemblance to the reality they had witnessed from inside the marriage. Elizabeth watched from the other side of a constitutional divide that sympathy could not bridge. She was the queen. Her sister's marriage had failed in the most public possible way. The monarchy would survive it. The monarchy survived everything. But the cost was real, a crack in the image of the family, a precedent that would make future royal separations and divorces slightly more thinkable, and the quiet, private knowledge that her sister was in pain and that the institution Elizabeth embodied had not protected her from it. The Queen Mother, too, absorbed the blow in her own way, with dignity, with composure, with the practiced grace of a woman who had survived worse things than her daughter's divorce, but with a sadness that friends later noted she never entirely lost. She had wanted the marriage to work. She had believed it could work. The failure was not just Margaret's or Tony's. It was a failure of the world the Queen Mother represented, a world in which charm and breeding and a good dinner party were supposed to be enough to hold a marriage together. For years, this marriage could be hidden inside rumor and managed through discretion. Now it had become an announcement, a headline, a constitutional event, and a public story whose ending was still being written. The divorce itself, the legal dissolution, the financial settlement, the formal severance of a union that had begun with 2,000 guests and 20 million television viewers was still 2 years away. And in those 2 years, the true shape of Tony's character and the full extent of what he had done and what he would continue to do to the people who loved him would become clearer than it had ever been. He did not waste those 2 years. That was one of the cruelest things about the end of the marriage. Margaret, for all her anger, still experienced the separation as a wound, as the formal acknowledgement that something she had once believed might save her had instead become another private catastrophe sanctioned by public language. Tony experienced it differently. He experienced it as movement. He had Lucy Lindsay Hogg. He had work. He had the confidence of a man who had spent years living in several emotional rooms at once and had never once been forced to admit in any complete way what he was doing in each of them. Once the announcement was made in March of 1976, he did not seem chastened by exposure. He seemed freed by it. That is not quite the same thing as saying he was happy. By every serious account, Tony Armstrong-Jones remained too restless for sustained happiness and too dependent on appetite, novelty, and work to stay still inside any arrangement for very long. But the separation gave him something he had wanted for years, a way out of one life without surrendering the prestige that life had given him. He remained Lord Snowdon. He remained a photographer of reputation and a man of consequence in the world of publishing, design, and society. He was not being cast out. He was not being disgraced. He was being allowed once again to move forward while someone else absorbed the uglier part of the story. Margaret did not have that luxury. The institution had always treated her private life as an extension of public duty, and now it treated her collapse the same way. She still had engagements. She still had patronages. She still had to be dressed, driven, announced, photographed, and returned to Kensington Palace, as though her life were merely entering a new administrative phase. But what had actually happened was harsher than that. She had spent 16 years in a marriage that had diminished her, and when that marriage finally broke in public, the country was inclined to believe that she was the guilty party. The photographs from Mustique had done their work. To the public, she was the princess with a younger lover. To the tabloids, she was excess, indiscipline, selfishness, and scandal in one small photogenic body. There is something about that reversal that is worth sitting with for a moment. Snowdon's betrayals had been numerous, brazen, and within aristocratic and media circles widely understood. Margaret's relationship with Roddy Llewellyn became the national scandal not because it was more serious, but because it was visible. That was the old bargain of this world. Men were permitted privacy inside their bad behavior. Women were judged once their unhappiness could be photographed. Margaret had rank. She did not have protection from that rule. Roddy, meanwhile, was learning that kindness was not enough to equip a man for the role he had wandered into. He had given Margaret relief. That much is not in dispute. He had made her laugh again. He had given her a place on Mustique, where she was not waiting for contempt to arrive in the next room. He had offered sweetness after years of private warfare. But by 1976, he had also become a symbol, and symbols are punished for meanings they did not choose. He was called her toy boy. He was written about as though he were both ridiculous and predatory. A younger man simultaneously mocked for immaturity and blamed for the end of a royal marriage. He could apologize. He could not alter the machinery that had already started moving around them. Inside Kensington Palace, the texture of Margaret's days grew harder. Some of her habits had been fixed for years. Late rising, breakfast in bed, hours of reading newspapers and smoking before the day properly began, evenings that stretched too long and required too much from drink and company. But after the separation, these habits no longer looked like the eccentric routines of a difficult princess. They looked like the structure of someone trying to dull the consciousness of her own life. Friends could still find her brilliant at dinner. Staff could still watch her turn on charm when she chose. Yet the effort of it had increased, so had the cost. What had once read as glamour was beginning to read as strain. By the spring of 1978, strain had become illness. What is known is this. Margaret was taken ill in May, at the very moment the legal machinery of divorce was moving into its final stage. Reports at the time and later biographical accounts described a princess physically depleted, emotionally exhausted, and increasingly unable to pretend that the damage done in private had not entered her body. That is often what people miss in stories like this. They speak about scandal as though it were purely social, something that exists in headlines and dinner tables and conversations overheard at Ascot. But scandal has a physiology. It changes the way a person sleeps. It changes appetite. It changes the breath in the chest and the look of the face and the quality of silence in a room. By the time Margaret's divorce reached court, she was no longer merely embarrassed. She was worn down. Tony, by contrast, kept moving with the unnerving ease of a man whose own emotional weather rarely settled into remorse. By then, he was filming in Australia with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, the woman who would become his second wife later that same year. Publicly, he issued statements in the cool, almost patrician register he knew how to perform so well. Privately, he was already arranging the next life, and even that was not the whole truth of him because the pattern did not stop with Lucy. Within 18 months, he had begun another long affair with the journalist Anne Hills, as though even the woman who had replaced Margaret could not actually contain him. That repetition matters. It rescues the story from a false explanation. Margaret was not uniquely impossible. Snowdon was repeating himself. The children, meanwhile, were old enough by now to understand what endings really are. David was 16. Sarah was 13. They had already lived through years of atmosphere, of tension, of silence, of their parents' separate worlds coexisting under the royal roof. But separation and divorce were different. They were public. They put dates onto things that had previously been felt rather than named. Their father was no longer simply absent in certain ways. He was elsewhere. Their mother was no longer simply unhappy. She was a woman whose unhappiness had become a matter of national discussion. For children born into publicity, there is a particular brutality in watching the country narrate your family before you have the language to narrate it to yourself. No one can say with certainty what David and Sarah said to one another in those months. Much of the dignity of their adult lives has consisted in not supplying the world with that kind of material after the fact, but the restraint itself tells you something. They had learned the family code. They had learned that one survives by keeping hold of one's interior life. David would move toward craftsmanship, would design, the solidity of made things. Sarah would move toward painting, private looking, the long discipline of making an image in quiet. Neither path feels accidental. Children do not always become the opposite of their parents. Sometimes they become the correction. The queen was pulled again into the old impossible position. She was Margaret's sister. She was also the sovereign. The same woman who might have wanted to comfort the younger sister she had known since nursery days was also the woman whose institution had to survive the symbolic shock of a royal divorce. That duality had shaped Margaret's life from the beginning. It shaped this ending too. Elizabeth could not publicly tell the whole truth about the marriage, because the whole truth would have required exposing what had been tolerated for years. Inside the family and around it, she could not publicly defend Margaret without widening the scandal. She could not publicly condemn Snowdon without acknowledging a level of intimate disorder that the monarchy had spent decades pretending it did not produce. So she did what she had always done. She maintained. The Queen Mother maintained too, though in a different register. For her generation, even now, marital pain remains something to be absorbed, with powder, pearls, timing, and nerve. She had wanted the marriage to work. She had enjoyed Tony and company. She had believed, as people of her class often did, that wit and style and a shared social world could carry a great deal more damage than they actually can. Watching the marriage fail meant watching one of the old assumptions fail with it. The right sort of people, beautifully dressed and properly connected, could still destroy one another behind closed doors. Good breeding did not prevent that, it merely altered the accent in which it was done. And then the court date came. On the 24th of May, 1978, Princess Margaret's divorce case appeared in the Supreme Court of Judicature Daily Cause List for hearing in the London Divorce Court in courtroom 44 of the Queen's Building. It was listed 20th in a batch of 28 cases. That detail matters because of how ordinary it is. After the wedding at Westminster Abbey, after the carriage procession, after the television cameras and the applause and the fantasy of modern royal romance, the marriage ended in a queue. One case among many. One more dissolution in a building designed to process them efficiently. The hearing, according to the archival description, was expected to take only a couple of minutes. That is the scale on which the law handles the collapse of lives. Margaret was not there. She did not need to be. The divorce moved through the court in her absence, on paper, with the speed and impersonality the system reserved for consent and inevitability. There is a scene there that almost writes itself, because it is so stripped of ornament. A judge in a London courtroom, files being moved from one side of a desk to another, names read out, counsel speaking in the neutral cadence of procedure. Outside, traffic. Inside, the marriage that had once seemed to embody a new royal age reduced to less than 2 minutes of judicial attention. No one raising a voice, no one saying what the marriage had actually been. No note from a drawer, no mention of Mustique, no mention of the hospital room, no mention of Peter Townsend or the Queen or the years of waiting upstairs while Tony disappeared into the basement. Just the law, doing what the law does when every human detail has already been pressed flat. It is tempting, when telling a story like this, to make the central tragedy loud. A smashed glass, a public confrontation, a dramatic walkout. But that is not what this tragedy was. Its devastation lay in how administrative it became. Two people had once imagined that marriage might rescue them from other injuries. 18 years later, it was being disposed of in the same city, with barely more emotional ceremony than a disputed tenancy. That is where the heartbreak is. Not in spectacle, in the reduction. The decree nisi was granted that May. By July, the divorce was finalized. It was the first divorce of a senior British royal in the modern era, and even then the language around it remained curiously clipped, as though the establishment still hoped brevity might limit significance. But significance does not work that way. The fact itself was enough. A marriage that had been sold to the public as glamour, modernity, and romance had ended in legal failure. The monarchy had crossed a threshold it had long pretended could not be crossed. Margaret was 47 years old. Tony was 48. Neither was old, yet the marriage already belonged to the past tense. Margaret, by several accounts, did not greet the divorce with theatrical devastation. She greeted it with something colder and sadder. Relief, certainly. But relief can be one of the bleakest emotions in the world when it arrives after years that should never have had to be survived. The reported line she gave when Lord Napier conveyed Tony's wish for divorce, that it was the best news he had ever given her, belongs here because it tells the truth more clearly than any statement drafted by the palace. A marriage does not end like that unless it has become intolerable in the ways other people were never required to see. What followed almost immediately made the wound sharper. On the 15th of December, 1978, Snowdon married Lucy Lindsay Hogg. There are moments in family histories when time itself behaves like an insult, and this was one of them. July, the divorce completed. December, the remarriage. The speed said what Tony did not have to say aloud. The next arrangement had not been discovered after the end of the first. It had already been waiting. By the following year, there would be a daughter, Frances, a new household, new rooms, new photographs. The old pattern merely transferred into a fresh set of names. Margaret could be caustic. She could be vain. She could be difficult in ways that exhausted the people around her. All of that was true. And still, there is something pitiless about imagining what that winter must have felt like from inside Kensington Palace. The country had watched her marriage crack. The law had finished with it. Her former husband had remarried before the year was out. The younger man who had briefly made her feel less lonely was not, and could never really become, a replacement for the structures that had fallen away, and she herself was left in the same royal rooms, under the same portraits, with the same title, except that now the title carried the memory of public failure as well as privilege. Yet even here, the story refuses simplicity. Because Margaret and Tony did not become melodramatic enemies in the clean way audiences sometimes prefer. Over time, after the worst sterilizing years had passed, there were postcards again. There was a grim, exhausted kind of affection. There were old jokes and old habits of address that survived the legal death of the marriage. That does not redeem what happened. It complicates it. Most real marriages do not end in a single emotion. They end with anger, relief, loyalty, memory, dependency, contempt, and familiarity, all knotted together so tightly that even the people inside them cannot always separate one strand from another. If there is a last normal image before the story enters its true aftermath, it may be this. The winter of 1978, Christmas lights in London, Tony already elsewhere in the next version of his life, Margaret still in the palace, divorced, not yet old, but no longer young, trying to discover what self remained once the role of wife had been stripped from her and the fantasy of rescue had finally collapsed. Outside, the city moving as it always moved. Inside, a woman who had once been denied Peter Townsend, then denied tenderness inside marriage, now denied even the consoling illusion that suffering ennobles anyone. It does not. It simply leaves marks. And the marks were not confined to Margaret. David and Sarah still had to grow up. Roddy still had to discover whether love could survive publicity. Lucy still had to learn that becoming the next wife did not mean she had married a different man. The palace still had to live with the precedent it had hoped never to set. The divorce had ended the marriage. It had not ended the pattern. If anything, it made the pattern easier to see. And once you could see it, you could not unsee it again. The years after a royal divorce are often narrated as though the legal ending were the true ending, as though once the decree is granted, the emotional story has the good manners to stop. It almost never does. In this case, it certainly did not. The separation and divorce had exposed what had been hidden. But exposure is not the same thing as repair. What followed was not recovery in any simple sense. It was distribution. The damage moved outward through everyone who had loved either of them, everyone who had depended on the fantasy of the marriage, everyone who had been shaped inside its weather. Margaret's relationship with Roddy Llewellyn continued, and for a time it continued to do what it had always done, soften her. Friends noticed it. Anne Glenconner remembered it. Even the Queen years later reportedly acknowledged it. After Margaret's funeral, Anne said the Queen thanked her for having introduced her sister to Roddy because he had made Margaret really happy. That is an extraordinary sentence when you stop over it. Not because it is romantic, because it is so modest, not he saved her, not he was the great love of her life, simply that he made her really happy. For a woman whose emotional life had so often been governed by constraint, disappointment, and performance, that may have been the most anyone could honestly say. But happiness of that sort is fragile when the press has already converted it into caricature. Roddy had not married into the royal family. He had been dragged into its glare. He was younger than Margaret, gentler than Snowdon, and far less equipped for the brutal comedy with which Britain treated men attached to royal women. He was mocked in headlines, treated as decorative, and reduced to a type. The relationship lasted for years, but it did not create a stable second life. It could not. Margaret remained Margaret, famous, scrutinized, difficult, formed by old disappointments and by an institution that did not know how to let its members become ordinary. Roddy remained, in the public imagination, the younger lover from Mustique. There was tenderness there. There was also pressure. And pressure, sustained for long enough, changes the thing it rests upon. When Roddy married Tatiana Soskin in July of 1981, Margaret did not respond with public drama. By then, she had had years of learning how to lose people without spectacle. What survived between them was friendship. That too matters. It suggests that what she had sought in him was never possession in the ordinary sense. It was solace. It was warmth at a time when warmth had become scarce. Once that season ended, the gratitude remained, even if the romance did not. Margaret herself never remarried. In one sense, that is not surprising. She had once been denied a marriage she wanted and then had endured one that degraded her. Marriage for her had already revealed both of its faces. There was no reason to expect she would trust it a third time. What followed instead was a narrower, lonelier life than the public often understood. There were still houses and staff and holidays and photographs, but the radius of real emotional safety remained small. She kept her friends. She kept elements of old routine. She kept going to Mustique. But the woman who emerged from the divorce was more brittle than the woman who had entered the marriage. There are injuries that do not announce themselves dramatically. They simply leave a person thinner skinned and more tired than before. Her health deteriorated slowly, then unmistakably. Heavy smoking, long years of drinking, emotional strain, and simple bad luck all played their part. In February of 1998, while at her holiday home in Mustique, she suffered a mild stroke. A year later, she severely scalded her feet in a bathroom accident, an injury that badly affected her mobility. In 2000 and 2001, she suffered further strokes. By then, the image of Princess Margaret that had once dominated the culture, the dazzling younger sister, the witty beauty, the woman at the center of the room with a cigarette holder in her hand, had been replaced by a sadder, more physically vulnerable figure, often in a wheelchair, moving through a much reduced life. It is one of the harshest aspects of public memory that it expects glamour to remain available long after the body has stopped being able to supply it. And yet, even in those final years, she continued, where she could, to support the organizations that had structured so much of her public life. The public often remembered her only through scandal, style, and disappointment, but the official record is fuller than that. She had patronages. She had a long, genuine connection to the arts. She had been a devoted supporter of ballet for decades. The same woman who could be cruel at dinner could also be loyal in her commitments for half a lifetime. This is why neat moral arrangements fail around real people. They never contain enough of the truth. On the 9th of February, 2002, Princess Margaret died at the King Edward VII Hospital after a further stroke. She was 71 years old. Her children, Lord Linley and Lady Sarah Chatto, were at her side. The official announcement was brief, as official announcements always are, but the image that remains is not official at all. It is of the son and daughter who had grown up inside the marriage that defined her adult life, standing at the end of the story with her when almost everyone else from the opening chapters was gone. That is one of the ways family works, even after damage. People may not be able to save one another from history. They still arrive at the bedside. Her funeral, held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was unusual in one important respect. Margaret was cremated, and her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. Even in death, there was a faint sense of her doing things a little differently from the older royal script. Not rebelliously, simply not quite in line. That had been true of her all her life. Snowdon's aftermath followed the pattern one might have predicted by then, though prediction does not make it less painful for the people who had to live through it. His marriage to Lucy Lindsay Hogg produced a daughter, Frances, in 1979. For a time, that new household seemed to promise what the first had not delivered: steadiness, domesticity, a second chance. But the essential fact about Tony had never changed. He was still Tony. Within 18 months of the wedding, he had begun a long affair with the journalist Anne Hills. Lucy, discreet and loyal, remained by his side for years despite that. Then came the next revelation. In the late 1990s, while working with Country Life editor Melanie Cable Alexander, Snowdon fathered a son, Jasper, born in April of 1998. Lucy moved out. Divorce proceedings were set in motion. The public by then was no longer surprised. That may be the most damning thing that can happen to a man's reputation. Not that people think him wicked, but that they think him predictable. And there was more. The old secret of Polly Fry, born in 1960 to Camilla Fry, finally hardened into documented fact in 2004 when a DNA test confirmed that Snowdon, not Jeremy Fry, was her biological father. That revelation reached back across 44 years and altered the beginning of the story from the far end. It meant that even before the wedding to Margaret had properly settled, another child already existed in the outer ring of his life, another compartment, another private truth, waiting decades to become public. When people describe Snowdon as complicated, that is what they usually mean. But complication can sometimes become too polite a word. He was not merely complex. He was structured around secrecy, and secrecy always leaves someone else carrying the weight. None of this erased his work. That is another discomfort the story has to hold. Snowdon remained, in the artistic sense, significant. The National Portrait Gallery describes him as a photographer, filmmaker, designer, and campaigner for disability rights, with hundreds of portraits in its collection. His portraits of politicians, artists, and members of the royal family helped define the look of post-war British public life. He designed the aviary at London Zoo with Cedric Price and Frank Newby. He campaigned for disabled people with seriousness shaped, in part by his own experience of polio. He was, in professional terms, much more than Princess Margaret's husband, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The difficulty is that talent does not cancel damage. The world is full of gifted people who leave wreckage in private. Snowdon belonged to that old and very crowded category. He died on the 13th of January, 2017, at his home in Kensington, aged 86. By then, Margaret had been gone for almost 15 years. The marriage that had once dominated both their lives belonged to history, but history had not stopped generating new meanings from it. He left behind a body of work, a public reputation, children from different chapters of his life, and a trail of relationships that still resisted tidy explanation. Death can simplify a biography on paper. It does not necessarily simplify it in memory. The children, though, are where the story's long emotional line becomes clearest. David Armstrong-Jones was born into one version of the family and inherited another. Born in November of 1961, he entered the world as Lord Linley, son of a princess and a rising photographer who had not yet become Lord Snowdon. By the time he was old enough to form stable memories, the marriage was already under strain. By the time he was a teenager, it had collapsed in public. And yet his adult life suggests less appetite for spectacle than for construction. He trained as a craftsman in wood, opened a workshop in Dorking in 1985, and built the company that became Linley, associated with bespoke furniture, marquetry, and a particular kind of highly finished British luxury. He made things. That detail matters. In a family history marked by emotional instability in public theater, the son turned toward joinery, grain, structure, finish, and endurance. He is 64 years old now. After his father's death in 2017, he inherited the earldom and became the second Earl of Snowdon. Professionally, he remains associated with the design world through Linley and through the reputation he built as David Linley long before the title came to him. There is an echo there of both parents, but altered. He inherited his father's eye for design and his mother's place within the royal story. He seems to have made of those inheritances something steadier than either of them managed together. Sarah, born on the 1st of May, 1964, took a quieter route still. She is 61 now. She trained at Camberwell and the Royal Academy schools and has long exhibited under the name Sarah Armstrong-Jones rather than trading heavily on royal styling. The Redfern Gallery has shown her work for decades. In 2024, she became president of the Royal Ballet School, a role that carries a direct line back to her mother, who had loved ballet and served as the school's president for many years. That is one of the gentler threads in the aftermath. Not all inheritance is damage. Some of it is continuity. Some of it is taste, discipline, the passing on of an enthusiasm in better condition than the marriage itself. Sarah also remains, in the present tense, one of the quieter presences around the royal family. She does not undertake public duties in the modern working sense, but she appears at family events and commemorations. In April of this year, she joined King Charles for events marking what would have been Queen Elizabeth II's 100th birthday. That small public image carries more weight than it first appears to. The daughter of Princess Margaret, once the family scandal, moving quietly through the commemorative life of the monarchy as an artist, a cousin, a surviving witness. She is part of what remained after the noise. What remained physically is more scattered. Kensington Palace still stands, of course, but not as the private world the Snowdons once inhabited. Niemann's remains, with its wider estate under National Trust care. And on Mustique, Les Joliot still exists, transformed now into a rentable, legendary villa, a royal refuge converted into luxury history. That may be the most modern fate possible for such a place, the site of private joy and public scandal repackaged as experience. The cultural afterlife of Margaret and Snowdon has been vigorous, which is another way of saying the public has never stopped wanting this story in forms it can consume. Anne de Courcy's Snowdon. The biography, published in 2008, remains one of the key works in shaping modern understanding of him. Lady Anne Glenconner's memoir gave later audiences some of the most intimate glimpses of what Margaret's daily life had actually felt like. Television inevitably moved in too. Netflix's The Crown made the marriage globally legible all over again. Vanessa Kirby and Matthew Goode for the earlier years, Helena Bonham Carter and Ben Daniels for the later implosion. The series captured a great deal. The allure, the sexual charge, the class friction, the emotional asymmetry, the way glamour can disguise corrosion for years. What it could not fully capture, because no screen version can, was the long administrative grind of real damage, the patience of humiliation, the repetitive nature of contempt, the years in which nothing explodes and yet a life is steadily being made smaller. That is the difference between adaptation and history. Adaptation gives you pattern. History gives you residue. History leaves drawers, court lists, hospital rooms, old postcards, children who do not tell all they know, and a family that goes on carrying a version of the event long after the newspapers lose interest. So what remains of the name and what remains of the damage? The name remains, certainly. Windsor remains. Snowdon remains. Titles continue. David carries the earldom. Sarah carries the visual inheritance of both parents into a quieter artistic life. The houses remain in altered forms. The photographs remain. The footage remains. The headlines remain. Public memory remains, though it is unstable and often unfair. What does not remain is the illusion that the marriage was only what the photographs showed. That illusion is gone. The public once saw a glamorous princess and a gifted bohemian photographer standing at the front edge of a more modern monarchy. What was happening behind that image was lonelier, harsher, and much more recognizable than the fantasy allowed. There is no neat moral to that. There is only the pattern. Wealth and title did not protect Margaret from private humiliation. Talent and freedom did not make Snowdon kinder. The palace could preserve the facade for years, but the effort of preserving it consumed the energy that might have been used to face what was actually wrong. The children inherited not a fortune in any meaningful emotional sense, but a set of silences, atmospheres, and strategies for survival. That is often what dynasties pass down when the cameras are gone. In the end, perhaps the most revealing image is still the smallest one. Not Westminster Abbey, not Mustique, not the court list, a note hidden in a drawer, a private insult place where only one person would find it. The whole story is in that gesture. The public grandeur outside the room, the private cruelty inside it, and the long silence required to keep the two from touching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss more stories about what was really happening behind Britain's most famous names.